Well, welcome everybody. It is time to start. So let me get going here. Today we're going to be talking about enterprise security risk management in global security. And it is just a pleasure to have you here. We'll be hearing from Dr. Joshua Sinai in just a moment. Now, let me talk about the agenda that we'll be following today, and then we'll get pretty much right into the presentation. I want to talk just very briefly about capital technology and then some session pointers or housekeeping. I'll introduce our presenter, and then we'll get right into the presentation. We've not enabled mics or cameras today. And so if you want to communicate with us, then you'll need to do that through text chat. I'll explain that in a little bit for when we get to the Q&A. Then we'll talk about our upcoming webinars for May and June. And finally, how, again, return to the housekeeping, how to get a copy of the recording, slides, and certificate. I do want to mention that the session is being recorded, and we will make a copy of the recording and a copy of the slides available to everyone who is registered for the session today. When we come to this section of the presentation, I always have to laugh to myself because I know that many of you are highly involved with Capital Technology University. Some of you are alums, some of you are faculty, some of you have been involved with us for many years. And so as I used to say, I'm carrying Colts to Newcastle, telling you something that you already know, but there may be a handful of people out here who do not know much about us. So let me go ahead and just mention, we were established nearly 100 years ago. In this decade, we will celebrate our 100th anniversary. We're one of the very few private universities in Maryland and really in the entire country that is specifically dedicated to the STEM area, to engineering, cyber, computer science, the management of technology, and all of these related technology. And it is by no accident that technology is literally in our middle name. We're nonprofit, private, and accredited, and I could take time to unpack each one of those, but I really want to focus in on the accredited because that's an area where there's massive confusion, particularly if you're coming to the United States from over outside of the U.S. borders. Capital is accredited with the the Commission of Higher Education of the Middle States Association of Colleges and Schools. Say that 3 times fast. The Middle States Commission is a regional commission that manages all of the universities in a certain part of the United States. The United States is broken into 6 different regions, and the highest level of accreditation that any university can receive in the country is within one of those 6 regions, and we're in the Middle States, which is, again, the highest level of accreditation that any university or college in the United States can achieve. We're also authorized by the state of Maryland, where we're physically located, to confer degrees all the way from our 2-year associate degrees right up to our doctoral degrees. And this is not a commercial for the university, but we do want to invite you that if you would ever have an interest in pursuing a degree with us, to let us know. Now, moving on, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about the session pointers. We'll answer questions at the conclusion of the presentation, but you can actually type them in at any point in the text chat. We'll be monitoring those and return to them. We'll answer just as many as we can in the time that we have in this session. As I mentioned earlier, microphones and webcams are not being activated for participants, so this is the way you'll need to participate with us. A link to the recording and to the slides will be sent to all registrants and available on our webinars webpage next week. A participation certificate will be available, and we'll let you know how to get that in just a little bit toward the end of the presentation. I want to take a slight deviation from our normal attendance, what we do in the housekeeping, to thank Aslak Mover. I probably just mispronounced his name because I've never met him in person. He is in the audience today. He is based in Oslo, Norway, and is a regular participant with us in the Cap Talk webinar series. Today is the 10th consecutive webinar that he has attended. I have a feeling that Dr. Lawless, who's also in the audience, is also in his 10th one, but I didn't know that for sure, so I didn't include him on this document. But we want to thank all participants, whether this is your very first time or, as in Aslak's case, it's the 10th time that you've participated with us. It's very meaningful to us that you find these so helpful, that you would attend session after session. But again, if this is your very first session, we hope that you'll find what we have to say interesting and helpful professionally, and you'll want to continue on and follow with it in other webinars. I'll talk about what webinars are coming up in just a little bit. But again, thank you to those who have regularly joined us. I want to get now back to our presentation. It is Enterprise Security, Risk Management, and Global Security. And let me talk just a little bit about the presenter. And if you don't mind, I'll go ahead and read this so that I make sure I cover the key points. Dr. Joshua Sinai has over 35 years of experience in national, international, and homeland security studies with the U.S. government, academia, and the corporate sector. He has worked with the U.S. Federal Research Division of the Library of Congress as a senior intelligence analyst, and with the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI Foreign Terrorist Tracking Task Force as a private sector contractor. Dr. Sinai is well published in academic journals, trade magazines, edited volumes, and training curricula. His pocket guide, Active Shooter, a handbook on prevention, is a best-selling book on public safety that details active shooter incidents, preparation, prevention, and tactical responses. He earned his bachelor's degree from the State University of New York, New Paltz, and both his master's and his PhD in political science and comparative politics from Columbia University. Now, with that, I'm going to give control over to Dr. Sinai. Bear with us just a little bit as we go to a screen sharing mode so he can run his slides. So just bear with us, and I will give that authority to him. All right, Dr. Sinai, see if you can share your slides at this point.
Yes.
This may take two times. There we go.
Yes.
I can see them.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. So please go ahead.
And by the way, thank you very much. And by the way, I'd also like to thank, I think, 3 participants from Australia who have joined the webinar, and I think it's 2 a.m. Australian time. So I hope that my presentation will help to keep them awake.
Yes, and welcome to anyone as you join this session, whatever the time of day might be or night may be. Go ahead, please.
Yeah, and also, I'd like to let everyone know that the diagrams behind me are pre-incident activities that led to major terrorist attacks are completely unclassified. There's nothing in my office that's classified. I know it's a huge problem nowadays, but I just wanted to reassure everyone that it's completely unclassified. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present an illustrative approach to examine risk management in global security. Please regard my framework as a pilot approach that is being refined. I'm also writing an article for ASIS International on this topic, which will be published online in their journal Security Management in September 23. So you'll have an opportunity to read about it in more detail. And also at our university, we're developing a course on risk management at the master's and bachelor's levels. The field of risk management is so significant that it has been codified in governments and industry trade associations, standards and guidelines. The US government's NIST, for example, has published the RMF framework. AS International has published 2 standards, one in 2015 and one in 2019. And one of the leading textbooks on risk management is by Thomas Norman, which was published in 2016. In fact, I wish he would come out with a new edition so that he could update his approach. This presentation is divided into 4 parts.
Joshua, just wait 1 minute. Apparently there's a little bit of technical glitch with the slides, and so let me see if I can adjust that. Okay, please share your screen again.
Can you see it now?
I can, thank you, and I apologize for that.
Good.
That was an error on my part.
Mm-hmm. Should I show the previous slide, or?
Yes, that would be helpful.
Oh yeah, so the field of risk management is so significant that it has been codified in governments and industry trade associations, standards and guidelines, such as the NIST framework, two standards by ASIS International, and one of the leading textbooks is by Thomas Norman, which was published in 2016. And I wish he would come up with a new edition so that we could all benefit from his insights. So the goal is to lower overall risk. This presentation is divided into 4 parts: defining risk, assessing risk and determining risk tolerance, prioritizing risk mitigation measures, with the overall objective to attain resilience. Oh, and by the way, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the chat so that I can respond to them during the presentation. These are some of the significant risk categories challenging the international community. They range from natural caused events such as severe climate attacks, natural disasters such as earthquakes. There are human caused and also natural caused risks such as pandemics, which we have just experienced. And one interesting question to examine is, in 2018 and 2019, was it possible to predict the full magnitude of the risk of the outbreak of the COVID-19 pandemic? Bill Gates in 2015 actually wrote an article in which he warned the possibility of such a pandemic. And now, are there emerging pandemic risks that are being anticipated and prepared for? And another risk that everyone is concerned about is that of global warming. There are also human-caused events that present significant risks, such as military aggression by rogue states, especially, for example, Russia and Ukraine. So what was the risk level in January 2022 when Russia began deploying its forces along the border with Ukraine? Did anyone forecast that the war would still be ongoing to this day? And what is the risk level currently that is being anticipated? And now everyone is concerned about the risk of China invading Taiwan in terms of future attacks. Are there other military aggression type risks that we should anticipate? Everyone is concerned about in the cyber realm of rogue elements targeting critical infrastructures. Another major risk that is very significant is disinformation, which is also defined as malinformation or misinformation. So, as you know, there's been the risk of Russian influence campaigns in the US in the presidential campaign in 2016. So measures were taken in 2020 to mitigate it. Now the presidential election result deniers present a major risk that I'm sure that electoral boards and others are preparing to counter. Another major risk is the possibility of rogue states or sub-state actors targeting orbiting satellites, which could damage the critical infrastructure in space. Terrorism represents a major global risk, whether by organized groups or lone actors, whether they are domestic or transnational. Will some of them conduct attacks involving weapons of mass destruction? Economic crises represent a huge risk in global security, especially financial crises. Everyone is concerned that high interest rates are resulting in the collapse of major banks, such as the Silicon Valley Bank and others. Shortages in the supply chain of major commodities and foods do represents a major risk that everyone is concerned about. And there are other risks, such as the risk of the outflow of mass refugees and others that need to be anticipated. So it's very important for decision makers and those working for them to put together buckets of major risks in global security that need to be anticipated and mitigated. To assess how various categories of risks might impact on international security, the first requirement is to define it. So this is a definition that I've come up with based on others that have been formulated. So it can be defined as the likelihood and extent of severity of the occurrence of a threatening event that can adversely impact the security of a country, a population, an organization, a company, or other entities. Risk is a function of the interaction between threat actor, vulnerability to be attacked, and consequence of being attacked. Risk management involves the whole process of mitigating risk. And so one way of defining it is that risk management is a function of the impact of mitigation measures on risk in terms of the impact on the rough order of magnitude of the cost of mitigating the risks. So this is a formula that risk management practitioners can use to estimate how much it will cost to mitigate risks of concern. And I'll be discussing this in greater detail later on. So in terms of threats, the first component in risk assessment, it involves at least three components: intent, a motivation for attack, and this can cover either terrorism or military aggression, or even the threat of a virus targeting a population. So in the second component of intent of the targets that the threat actor is seeking to attack, and the attack modes, and I'll be discussing this in greater detail. The second major component is the capability of the threat actor to actually carry out an attack. And the third component is local presence, to carry out an attack. If you don't have a local presence, then how can you attack a target? This also concerns the ability of a virus to attack its target. Now, in terms of local presence, with cyber warfare, the attacker can launch an attack from computers anywhere around the world. Nevertheless, they still need to reach the intended target. In calculating threat, we can use a 5-point scale. And this is for illustrative purposes. And it ranges from 1, negligible, to 5, ongoing or imminent. This is an illustrative worksheet to map the threat level by a terrorist adversary. It can be used to map any other category of threat as well. So we begin with entering information about the terrorist, for example, in anticipating the threat level by a terrorist adversary. It's first necessary to identify the terrorist type that is likely to carry out the attack, whether it's an organized group or a lone actor, their ideology, their intent in terms of motivation. Are they foreign or domestic? The location of their planned attack or attacks, domestic, international, or within a country, in urban or rural targets. Their modus operandi. Are they going to attack and escape from the incident? Are they going to carry out a suicide attack? Are they going to be insiders who are known to some of their intended victims? Are they going to carry out a workplace violence attack, and so on? And then the type of intended targets for their attack. Are they iconic buildings, transportation nodes, public places? Are they going to attack civilians or the military or both? And the types of weapons that they're likely to use in an attack. Are they going to be firearms, improvised explosive devices, vehicles, edged weapons such as knives, cyber weapons, or WMD weapons? And then we would come up with a likelihood score, whether it's negligible, low, medium, high, or imminent. In calculating the vulnerability to be attacked, there are 4 factors that are needed to calculate it on a 5-point scale. So vulnerability factors include, and by the way, there may be more than 4. The target attractiveness to the attacker, target hardness, how difficult it is to attack it, the attack achievability, how capable are the attackers likely to successfully attack the target, and the target's security posture in terms of being able to protect the target, detect an adversary, decide to do something about the potential attack, engage the adversary, and defeat the adversary. And this, by the way, also is relevant to detecting the threat of a virus to attack a human being. So how do you protect the target? By encouraging them to wear facial masks or receive booster shots, and then how do you defeat the target, whether by calling in the local police department or actually having your own force to go after the adversaries. And then you can score it on a scale of 1 to 5. Some vulnerability, low vulnerability to be attacked, medium vulnerability, highly vulnerable to be attacked, or completely vulnerable to be attacked. In terms of consequences of being attacked, there are at least 4 types: death and injury, symbolic impacts or psychological impacts of being attacked, financial impacts, and in global security, national security impacts. For example, weakening a country's national security posture when a major attack takes place, such as 9/11, and making the country look defenseless, and so on. So you can break these down into their component units. And these are 2 examples of the consequences from successful terrorist attacks. One involves attacking a private sector target, the other one a national security related target. So in terms of attacking a private sector target, consequences might be high number of fatalities and injuries, physical damage, financial damage, suspended business operations, increase in insurance risk premiums, and brand reputation damage. This is why the framework of risk assessment and risk management is extensively used in the insurance risk premium industry. And then in attacking national security related targets such as the World Trade Towers or the Pentagon or the White House or the other iconic facilities. So the consequences would be massive death and injury, again, symbolic or psychological impacts, financial impacts, and national security impacts. Now, in calculating consequences, we can use a 5-point scale ranging from negligible to low, medium, high, or catastrophic. This, unfortunately, is one of the confusing aspects of risk assessment that I've come across in the literature in formulating a consensual formula that everyone can use. And even I haven't come up with a formula that is completely acceptable. So, for example, one formula that is used to assess overall risk is by threat times vulnerability times consequence, with risk, let's say, on scored on a scale of 1 to 5, vulnerability 1 to 5, and consequence 1 to 5. So once you multiply them, let's say if the risk is at its highest, then you'd come up with a score of 125 to denote the highest possible risk total. Now, to me, the highest possible risk total should be scored at 100. So this way, you could score, let's say, this is what I tried to do in the second formula that actually I sort of invented, in which each component is scored at a maximum of 33 1/3, so that they total 100 as the highest possible risk total. But then again, some people might say that they're not all equal, so you can't give vulnerability a 33 1/3 score. But for illustrative purposes, I find this to be useful. So, for example, so a 100 score would denote the highest possible risk represented by this certain scenario, and so on. And then there are other formulas. For example, the US Coast Guard has come up with a risk model called the Risk Security Assessment Model. In which, again, the threat is represented by a percentage of attack probability times consequences in terms of the amount of dollar damages represented by an attack, and the vulnerability in terms of the likelihood of the attack success, which again is represented by a percentage. So I'd be interested in hearing from you what you consider to be the most efficacious formula to use to assess overall risk in a scenario that is of concern to you. Once the overall risk level is scored, the next step is to determine the affected entity's risk tolerance. Some people use risk appetite, but I like to use risk tolerance because it sounds more scientific. So such a scoring system can also be used to measure what the risk assessment policymakers might deem to be a level of risk that is considered to be acceptable. This is a controversial degree of risk because to some, even an acceptable level of risk might be considered as unacceptable. For example, is having terrorists in a country kill only a few of the citizens in their attacks annually an acceptable level of risk that will not change overall counterterrorism policies since they're considered to be effective, whereas having several dozen citizens killed by terrorists annually would be considered as unacceptable and thereby leading to new counterterrorism response measures. And you could say the same with risk tolerance for active shooter events at schools. To some, it's what is the number of killings is completely unacceptable. But to others, it's acceptable, and as a result, there's no need, for example, to legislate gun control policies. So this is one of the reasons why I like to try to figure out the level of risk tolerance vis-a-vis the different risk scenarios that are of concern. There are 3 levels of risk mitigation. One, and actually this is something that I've sort of invented. There's the strategic mitigation, which is at the government level, which involves formulating strategies and policies, such as national strategies. There's mitigation at the operational level, where government agencies or private sector security departments are involved. For example, after 9/11, an example of operational mitigation was the establishment of the Department of Homeland Security and the passing of the Patriot Act and other measures. Then you have mitigation that takes place at the tactical level, where practical defensive measures will be deployed, such as cybersecurity defensive systems, vaccinations, lockdowns, containing carbon dioxide emissions to reduce the risk of climate change, in terrorism, surveilling and arresting suspicious persons, coming up with counter-disinformation narratives to mitigate the risk of disinformation campaigns. And overall, where possible, it's important to estimate the effectiveness and cost of mitigation and estimate the return on investment for the mitigation measures. And there's a way to quantify these costs. One of my associates, Jeffrey Fuller, who's also a member of our dissertation committees, has come up with a very effective and practical methodology to estimate the effectiveness and cost of mitigation measures to result in a return on investment that security departments can present to their executive leadership. So that there are ways of operationalizing this in a quantifiable way. This is an illustrative worksheet to map a risk management framework per risk category. So in the first column, you would enter information about the risk type that you were concerned about, such as terrorism or pandemics or climate change or disinformation. The nature of the threat, the scoring that you've come up for the threat, the nature of the vulnerability to be attacked by the threat, and then the score that you have given to the vulnerability, the consequence of being attacked, and again, you would come up with a score for it. And this will help you to produce an overall risk score. And then you would enter in information and scoring on the risk tolerance per risk type, with high, low, medium, and so on. And then you would enter information on your prioritized mitigation measures that will be used to mitigate this particular risk. So I find this very useful. So the objective is to attain overall resilience. And I've noticed that a lot of people talk about resilience, but when you ask them to operationalize it, they can't. So I've come up with an approach to operationalize resilience. First, you need to define it, and it involves being prepared to effectively respond to and recover from expected and unforeseen catastrophic events in a way that will not disrupt the continual functioning of a threatened entity. And resilience results from effectively managing the 4 phases of the mitigation cycle, which are to anticipate potential risks, prepare to defend against them by, for example, coming up with emergency response plans, responding to potential risks, and recovering from risks. And the objective is to attain resilience following disasters and catastrophes. We also attain resilience by preventing the risks from playing out. And it involves 10 components, and I've ordered them in alphabetical order. So the first one involves being effective at conducting crisis communications, in having a robust cybersecurity program, in being able to manage disasters effectively, in attaining financial security following a disaster. In human capital involves a population or a workforce. So having a robust workforce following a catastrophe, being compliant in terms of legal and regulatory laws and regulations, which is extremely important. Maintaining physical security, having a robust and healthy socioeconomic ecosystem, such as effective medical system, transportation system, and so on in your environment. And this is a component that I've actually invented. It's called strategic innovation. It's very important to always be strategically innovative. So for example, at the beginning of the pandemic, restaurants were severely damaged by the lockdowns because they couldn't have customers eat in the restaurants, so they built up their takeout and home delivery systems. Or clothing companies started manufacturing facial masks and PPEs. And another very important component in attaining resilience is effectively managing one's supply chain and procurement, which is of huge concern today. For example, with the rivalry between the US and China, the US is trying to locate strategic minerals that can be developed by allies or that can be found domestically. So efficiently managing the security risk management yields all sorts of benefits. First, this type of framework provides a structure for informing decision-making on prioritizing challenges in terms of risk categories and the efficient allocation of resources to mitigate them. By prioritizing potential risk categories and mitigation measures, it demonstrates due diligence and compliance with government laws, regulations, and industry standards. It generates cost-benefit return on investment. It lowers one's insurance risk premiums. It also helps one to maintain competitive business advantage. And in the best-case scenario, effectively applying this framework will substantially upgrade the overall resilience of a threatened country, society, corporation, organization, or another entity that engages in risk management and risk mitigation. But one has to always accept that a certain level of risk, even if minor, may still persist. So risk may not be completely eliminated, but at least it will be substantially reduced to what are considered to be acceptable levels. I hope you found this presentation interesting, and please let me know if you have any questions.
Bill, you're muted.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, that is so helpful to actually unmute. My apologies for that. I was too busy trying to convert back from his slide share to mine that I forgot to handle the rudimentary things. There have been a number of different questions and comments that have asked. I'm just going to start with the first one and we'll move through them. I'll read them back to everybody so that you don't, because you don't have access to the chat. George says, I notice screen risk for high. With so many federal agencies claiming to be at a high level, such as hurricane tracking, etc., can high risks ever be truly green based on both security and privacy risk noted in the NIST 800-53 Rev 5 documentation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. So, for example, for coastal communities that are especially affected by hurricanes, I suppose that upgrading their construction standards and other measures would help to lower their overall risk in terms of their vulnerability to being attacked by hurricanes, and would also lower the consequences of such attacks. So there are measures that can be taken. The question is, if, let's say, the agency to come up with the mitigation measures is at the federal level, or at the state level, and local levels, they're refusing to implement them. So I guess there has to be a unity of effort at all levels to mitigate such risks.
A much higher level of coordination than we've heretofore seen. John makes a comment. He said the Transportation Research Board, trb.org, developed a risk model that focuses on consequence given the fluid nature of threat. So just mentioned that. John has additional questions and comments later that we'll return to. Aslak asks...
well, actually, you know, in response to that, what I've noticed is that there are so many different formulas that have been formulated to measure risk, that there really needs to be a central archive to store them. I don't think there is such a central archive.
No, in fact, John mentions in his comment, he says regarding the risk formula, as a former government official in transportation, I had to use the formula put forward by the federal agency that governed me. So for a port, it would be the U.S. Coast Guard model. For an airport, it would be the TSA. All the models vary just a bit. It's frustrating for the parent company, the DOT, as all the models are not consistent and the results not comparable.
Right, so that's why if there was a centralized place for all of these models, then those in public safety could draw on them if they need to come up with a tailored formula that could apply to their sector. So I remember a long time ago, there was a proliferation of red team exercises on different types of threats. And at the time I was at the Department of Homeland Security Science and Technology Directorate, and it occurred to me that every meeting someone would propose to red team a certain kind of threat, but I was aware of other efforts. So it seemed that every time someone would come up with a way to reinvent the wheel, that it already existed. And I think it's the same with risk management methodology. So if there was a centralized archive, it would be digitized, that one could refer to, it would save so much effort in having to come up with new methodologies all the time.
Good comment. Aslak asks a question. Being from Norway, he says, Norway has a long coastline and important resources regarding energy for Europe, with data cables and everything else. We're now experiencing a form of hybrid threat from Russian ocean-going spy vessels. This is quite extensive these days. How concerned should we be about international risk assessment? How concerned are international risk assessment organizations about this international threat?
Well, based on my reading of Washington Post and the New York Times and others, there's enormous concern about the risk of sabotage of critical infrastructure in Europe by Russian and other rogue operatives. So yes, so I'm sure that there are exercises being held to anticipate such risks and the mitigation measures that would be needed to lower these risks. So yes, it's a huge concern. That's why one has to come up with a bucket of potential risk scenarios that need to be anticipated and mitigated.
That actually leads to Michael's question. He says there appears to be a simplistic addition or multiplication factor in computing risk from its various factors, but are there examples of weighted various factors according to different scenarios and industries?
I'm sure there are, and I'd love to see them.
It does seem to me that the risk factor for a particular kind of industry would be different from a risk factor from another kind of industry, or from one part of the country to the next part of the country.
Yes.
A question, I want to come back to one question / comment that Maria asks: which formula is considered in ESRM, or the most rigorous formulas to achieve exact measurement of risk? I'm not sure I completely understand the questions, but I hope you do.
Yeah, I've looked at as Jeff Fuller has just pointed out, I guess the formulas have to be tailored to their respective risk categories. I've looked at the standards put out by ASIS and others, and I haven't really come up with any formulas that can actually be used. So this is an area in need of further exploration.
John comments here. He says, linking the discussion of risk to resilience, sometimes the lack of resilience can come from risks and vulnerabilities beyond the agency's control. For example, the undersea communications cables to Norway. They can't be controlled by an individual agency. You may want to comment on what you've seen, having worked very closely with multiple government agencies, of how the U.S., speaking in an unclassified way, of course, how the U.S. would work with their sister agencies from other countries to assess common risk.
Well, one thing that I've learned is that you're outside of government, you don't really know what is going on inside government. But I've met, lots of government officials, and I completely trust them. So I'm sure that the intelligence communities of, the allied countries are working on these issues.
I have a personal question. It relates to what you were saying about the use of guns earlier. And as I thought about it, as listening to your presentation, I realized the threat from external terrorism is always real. But it seems to me that the threat from domestic terrorism or these lone wolf shooters is actually numerically, more people are killed each year, more Americans are killed each year by that type of mass shootings than are killed each year by foreign terrorists. Now, that's not the question. That was the comment. The question is, do we, as a society, begin to have what we call threat fatigue, where we're so under threat all the time that we get used to that and we no longer are willing to deal with it in a meaningful way because we just assume it's part of life and a normal activity?
Yeah, so that relates to the issue of threat tolerance. So, I mean, some people are just besides themselves in just not believing that there wouldn't be a greater push to legislating gun control measures to restrict ownership of highly lethal weapons by persons who are deemed to be suspicious. For example, to increase background checks on such individuals. So, I mean, there are all sorts of measures that can be taken, but it's a very frustrating risk sort of sector to follow, because it's happening again and again and again. But there are also other issues involved. For example, many of the lone actors who carry out active shooter attacks are known to those in their surroundings as troubled individuals, but not enough is done to report them to appropriate authorities for preemption, whether by mental health, counseling, or arrest. So it's actually, there are actually a number of factors involved in mitigating this type of risk?
Well, thank you. I see our time is getting away from us, so I'm going to go ahead and stop the Q&A here and move on quickly so that we can conclude in our hour. We try to respect everybody's time. There are 2 upcoming webinars in this webinar season, one in May, one in June. In May, Kimberly Mansell, will talk about addressing small business cyber needs in conjunction with affordability and resources. Let me just mention a little bit about that webinar because it'll be fascinating. 99.5% of all businesses in America are considered to be a small business, less than 500 employees. But that same group representing the majority of businesses in the world, in the United States, do not have adequate cyber hardening. And Kimberly, working with the state of Maryland, has developed a program to help small businesses to harden their cyber and security and give them the resources that they need to do that. And it's a good applicable goal for all 50 states and around the world of how one state can help all of its small businesses succeed in this very important area. Then on June 15th, that's on May 18th, on June 15th, Dr. David Olivencia will be talking about networking excellence. Now, this is not networking as in connecting wires together, but networking in a human capacity, building a strong value-based network in an accelerating digital world. Dr. Olivencia will be looking at ways that people can network to enhance their careers and their prospects and do it in our digital world. It's very different from the days when you could just go to a networking meeting and pass your business cards around, a whole different way of operation. That'll be on June 15th. Now, for those 2 webinars and to see any of our webinars on demand, you can go to captechu.edu/webinar-series. Now, I want to just mention real quickly that I mentioned this early on, we hold master's and doctoral virtual information sessions every month. If you're interested in those, let us know, and we'll be happy to give you the information that you need about those. Now, with that, we're approaching the end of the presentation. A copy of the slides and a link to the recording is going to be sent to everybody who registered for the session, so watch for that email. In that email, I will also invite you to request a certificate of completion. We do not send those automatically, but we'll send them when requested. This is available to both you that are joining us for the live session and all of our on-demand viewers who watch it in a time-shifting manner. All you need to do is reply to that email. We'll be sending it to all registrants, and we'll be happy to provide a certificate of completion for you. With that, that concludes today's webinar. So watch for that follow-up email. I want to thank our presenter. It's been very informative. I want to thank all of you that joined us for this session. And you all have a great rest of the day. And we hope to see you next month for our May webinar. With that, we are concluded. And thank you very much.